Hey guys, welcome back to FHN, and we're obviously here in the bait lab. So we're going to take a little walk through of all these different fishing rods I have and reels on the top of the table here. We got a little bit of basic downrigger information to share with you, and just some really effective ways of getting to kokanee and being successful pursuing kokanee and not breaking the bank to do so. So even before we get to these little manual mounted downriggers that I used to fish off of the drift boat, or you can fish them off a little 12-foot boat, we can get even simpler than that. You can simply use lead to get down to the depth that you want. Now there's a couple different charts out there available that show you exactly the depth of water that you will cover depending on how many ounces of weight that you put on, okay? And the troll speed. So this chart that I want to show you today is based on trolling upwards of 1.5 miles per hour, and you can see there that if I use a 1 ounce weight and my setback is 10 feet, that's telling me that it's going to take my presentation down to 4 foot in depth. Now I like to fish my presentations typically about 80 to 100 feet behind the boat, believe it or not. So as I look down on that chart at we'll go to 100 feet. If I'm fishing 1 ounce of lead at 100 feet and trolling no faster than a 1.5 miles per hour, that is going to get me down to around 17 feet. Typically when I'm pursuing kokanee, I'm in that 1.2 range. So I would say it's safe to presume that I could be down in that 18 to 20 foot depth if I'm 100 feet setback. Now if I bump that to 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces, now I'm getting down into there where we get these June temperatures, driving those fish down to that 20-25 foot depth on some of our lakes. And simply by adding 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces of lead to my presentation, I'm going to get it down into that zone where hopefully I start finding some kokanee. So how do we do that? How do we add lead? Well, I take my basic kokanee rod. Now they're a lightweight rod. Most of them are 2 to 8 or a 4 to 10 or a 4 to 8 pound range. So they can handle 1 ounce, 2 ounces. Some guys will run up to 3 ounces, but depending on the size of kokanee that you're after, if you're adding 3 ounces of lead onto your presentation, it kind of negates the opportunity to fight the fish just because they're pulling against so much lead. They don't have a lot of spunk left in them. So basic kokanee presentation, all right? I think we can all agree on that. We're just running an Aeroflash Dodger. Got a little hoochie set up here. I don't want to put weight right above this swivel and think that my Dodger is going to perform the way it is designed to do so. I need to give it all the freedom and action that it needs to get doing what it's supposed to do in the water as an attractor. So I go literally a couple feet up my line and I clip on my lead. Now there's a couple different ways to do it. I have found great success with these little slider carriages. They simply just slide on your line, and there's a couple ways to do this. I like to use the rubber bobber stops, so I can spread these out and you can see what I'm talking about. So now that I've spread out those stops, this lead can flow freely back and forth on my line. Now you can fish it like that. There's nothing wrong with a traveling lead. Sometimes when you get fish close to the boat and you get the net out there, much like when we're pursuing their bigger brothers in Chinook and we fish those droppers on a slider, same principle. You're not going to get this stuff caught up in the net as much as if it was fixed. But oftentimes, because it's such a little bit of weight, we're not talking like 16 or 20 ounce cannonball, I take that slider and with a bead on either side of it, I can run these bobber stops down and basically pin that wherever I want to on my line. And on this one, I'm just with a dual lock snap underneath that slider. I've pinned a single 1 ounce cannonball on my main line. That's going to allow me to have just that extra amount of weight that I need to get to the depth that I want. Now I can hang a 2 or a 3 ounce on there. Again, I am going to run that a couple feet from the Dodger so that when the Dodger is in the water and has the freedom to move back and forth, I don't have that weight sitting right against it because it's going to negate the true action of that Dodger, okay? So that is one way to do it. It's pretty simple. It's going to allow you, as we transition from early season to mid-season, those kokanee begin to drop down deeper in the water column. It's going to allow you to get down into that 20-foot range or so. You can look up different charts on the internet that's going to give you that setback, that weight in ounces of weight that you add to your presentation. And of course, the speed of the troll is the key as far as how much blowback you're going to get. So be mindful of that. Play around with it. If you're marking fish on your electronics and you're trying to get down to them, play around with weights, play around with troll speed, and see if you can't get to the depth that you're after. Now, if you want to spend a little bit more money than just on some 1, 2, or 3 ounce cannonballs and a sliding weight setup and fix it on the main line as we did, you can pick up some real nice small compact downriggers. And again, these small little fiberglass units mount to the side of your drift boat. I fished them off my drift boat for years. Little 12-foot boat, 14-foot boat with an electric troll motor or gas motor, whatever you're utilizing for your troll. These are great because they're compact, they're portable. You just simply tighten them on the side of your boat and you're good to go. The nice thing about this particular model is it does have a depth gauge on here. Now, or a little depth meter, most of these hand crank ones, one time around on your spool with your cable is 1 foot of depth. So you can basically count those. If you don't have a reel counter or a line counter fixed on your downrigger, you can count that each time around is 1 foot of depth, so 30 cranks, you're down 30 feet, okay? These are nice because you don't have to sit there and count and you can truly watch them. Now, once in a while, these will bump and get a little off center. You just need to reset them to make sure they're zeroed out, all right? You simply run these, and there's different brands out there. Scotty makes a couple brands that, again, are hand cranked, but perhaps they are a little bigger in size. They got a little longer boom on them. These are definitely going to fish right alongside your boat. And basically, you know, your rod is coming up out of your rod holder and right back down to the side of your boat. No big deal. We used them for years. We've caught a ton of fish on these. They're not very expensive, and you really only need a 4-pound weight. You know, you got your couple foot clip on there. You put that on. Basically, you can use a 4-pound weight or a 6-pound weight depending on, again, how deep you're going to go and how fast you're going to troll. But definitely 4 pounds gets it done on your hand crank. 6 pounds is just a little more stable as far as making sure your line is straight vertical up and down and you truly gauge the depth that you're fishing. So just some options. Let's face it, this time of year, you got to start getting down to depth to find the kokanee because they are transitioning, go into that lower water column. They're going to find that thermocline that they like to hang out at. They find their feed. They find their comfort zone as far as water temperature. So they're not going to be on the surface anymore. You got to get down. So lead on your line, small hand crank downriggers is a great way to get started. That's not going to break the bank, okay? Now let's talk about rod and reel options. Now, there's a lot of different kokanee rods that have hit the market the last few years. And it depends. You can spend $150 on a fishing rod, or you can come all the way down to the bottom end here to this Eagle Claw, which for all intents and purposes, as far as a kokanee rod goes and the glass rod, this thing is extremely limber. Not to mention, they actually put a little measurer right here on the butt of the rod in case you forget your tape measure, you want to see how big those fish are. But this rod right here as a starting point for somebody who wants to get into kokanee fishing, maybe it's a good trout rod for the kids and whatnot too. Matter of fact, as an adult, you can have a lot of fun with a rod like this for trout. Now, it doesn't have your high-end guides and things like that, but again, cork handle, standard reel seat, lots of flexibility in this. It definitely will work for kokanee with their soft mouths. 24 bucks, basically 25 bucks out the door. You're going to find these Eagle Claw rods. Don't be afraid if you're going to outfit your boat with 3 or 4 rods. Don't want to break the bank. Pick up a handful of those. I think you're going to be pretty happy to get started in the kokanee fish on how they perform. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum. Lamiglass has been around forever, and they make a variety of series of different rods that you can use. We have the standard tournament rods. This 7.5-foot rod in a lady's pink is a fantastic rod. It's a 4 to 8 pound range. It's a 2-piece rod, works very well. It's going to run you about 85 bucks, okay? So 85, 7.5 foot, 4 to 8, great kokanee rod. It's tried and true, cork handle. It will last and do a very good job. If you want to go to one of my favorites that they came out with years ago in the kokanee rod realm. Now, one thing about this is the guides, the eyelets and the guides are extremely small, so you can't pass like an indicator knot or anything like that through these guides. And I'll speak on that in a minute when we talk about reels. But this is an 8-foot, 2-piece rod, 2 to 8 pound. It actually is, It actually is one of my favorite rods because it is so, I don't want to say flimsy, but it does have a bit of backbone in the bottom end of this thing, which is nice if you do get some of those bigger fish, or if you utilize your kokanee rods like I like to, when we do have opportunity for sockeye fisheries, that is like the best thing to do. And of course you can use these for trout, and you get into some of your bigger triploid trout and things like that. These rods are just a kick in the pants to utilize because of the line weight that they are. Classic Glass from Lama Glass has been around forever. These rods here, the tournament series, run you about 85 bucks. Classic Glass is going to run you about 70, 75 bucks depending where you get it. It's a 7.5 foot rod. Make sure I quote this right. Yeah, it's a 6 to 12. It's a little beefier. When you want to talk about doing those kokanee, or excuse me, those sockeye fisheries, this 6 to 12 is definitely going to get it done. Only rod you'll ever need to buy. It crosses over very well for both sockeye and kokanee. Graphite handle. The cork will never wear out because it doesn't have any in and out rod holders. Sometimes guys are concerned about that. Now I pay attention to that on my saltwater rods because you're in and out of the rod holders a lot. You're putting a lot of pressure on the butts of those rods, in and out rod holders, and you're pulling a lot more weight at depth and speed and all those things. Kokanee rods, for the most part, cork handles will last you a lifetime. You're not beating them up in the rod holders like you would on your bigger saltwater presentations. So don't think you have to have graphite handles that are going to last forever when it comes to kokanee rods. These cork handles are going to do just fine. So that Classic Glass is great if you're looking for a rod that crosses over in, again, to both kokanee and sockeye. 6 to 12, 7.5 foot, great rod. Pretty good value at about 70, 75 bucks. Velocity has been around for quite some time. They're making some great products. This is a 7.5 foot rod, 4 to 8. Again, you know, another option for kokanee. It's going to run you about 80 bucks, 75, 80 bucks, I think, in that ballpark. So you can see, I mean, between your Lama Glass Tournament Series and your Classic and your Velocity, you're all in that anywhere from 75 to 80, 85 dollars, just give or take. Just kind of depends what you're after. You know, again, if I have to pick any of these, I really am partial to the 8 foot. I like the longer rod for kokanee. It's just me. Now, you can go down even just a little bit more. You know, Tika's been making this kokanee rod series for a number of years. It's a 4 to 8, it's a 7.5 foot. It's going to run you about 50 bucks. It's a great buy. Again, if you're buying 3 or 4 rods, you can get a kokanee rod for 50 bucks. I mean, that's a smoking deal. It's a very good rod. It's going to last. It's doing everything you need it to do. And again, all these rods cross over. You can use them for trolling trout too because they work fantastic, and they just give you a lot more sensitivity and fun even when you're out pursuing a trout. And the kids are going to love it because of the flexibility of these rods. Let's talk a little bit about reel options. Line counters are fantastic because I really pay attention to my setback. So before you clip it into your downrigger, you got to get that line back behind the boat. Now, in theory, a lot of guys like to utilize the idea or concept, the deeper you go, the less farther or further you need to set back on your presentation. For me, it doesn't matter what depth I'm fishing. I've always been one that does a fairly long setback for a couple of reasons. But my number one reason for that is when I'm fishing and I recognize a school of kokanee, and maybe they're down at 35 feet, and I have my presentations at 20 and 25, maybe 30, but I realize I need to drop down to them just a little more to ensure that I hopefully will entice a strike before I pass through the school. If I am 30 feet behind the boat and I recognize that school of kokanee, I may go to adjust my downrigger. Now, maybe I get it down in time. Chances are, typically, I don't, and I've gone past the school before I've dropped down to the depth to where they're able to bite. So I typically, for the most part, will always utilize setbacks of 80 to 100 feet. I'm downrigger fishing. I don't have to worry about turning corners and things like that with rods on the surface and crossing lines and all that. They're in the clips, they're in control, they're down at depth. If I look and I recognize the school of kokanee and I'm 80 feet back, I got plenty of time to drop my presentation to a couple feet above where they're hanging out at because of, excuse me, I don't want to be obviously fishing below them. So I always, if I'm at 35 feet marking fish, 37 feet, I'm going to drop my gear to 33, 31, 32. That way when I pass over the school, they're looking up. Hopefully something's going to come and get them. More times than not, when I recognize that school, I adjust that gear as I go by. and it gives me opportunity to get a strike. If I'm 30 or 20 feet behind the boat, that's typically not going to happen. So just something to think about as far as your setbacks. So as I let that gear out and I set it in there, the line counters are great because it's telling me exactly obviously how far back my setbacks are, and if I have multiple rods I'm putting out, the line counter should all be the same or very close to the same. That's easy. Now if I don't want to break the bank and pay upwards of $100 on some of these reels or more for a line counter, there's things I can do. Some of these reels, this is a 4601 from Abu Garcia. It's a great small rod reel. Works great for lake fisheries, works great for summer on steelhead. I used it for years. I like using it on kokanee rods because it's small and compact. It's thumb controlled. Great little reel for kokanee. You can find a lot of these on your offer-ups and your different sales websites of people sharing stuff, even on eBay, things like that. Look around for these old Abu Garcias, 5601, 5600 series, 5500 series. The 01 series on your Abus is your left-handed reels, which I'm kind of partial to. This 4601, I spool that up with high-vis line. Not that it's going to bother the kokanee, because what I'll do is I'll finish that out with about a 20-foot top shot of clear mono as far as where it's down by my presentation. So I put the high-vis line on, and then I simply take a permanent marker, all right, if I can get it off my downrigger, and I'm going to peel line off of here, and at about depending what I want, 50 feet, I'll put about a 2 or 3 inch stripe of black, okay? At 75 feet, I'll put another marker of black, and at 100 feet, I'll put a marker of black. Now, yeah, at times you may end up cutting some line off the end, but I could always go back and add that back in with my top shot. So I don't really worry about it. Typically, it gets me through an entire season. I have a reel that I know how far back my setback is based on marking my high-vis line simply with a marker. And it affords me the ability to have a decent reel on my kokanee setup without a line counter, but I know exactly where my setbacks are. If I'm fishing on a little hand-controlled downrigger, I know exactly how deep I'm fishing, and those two complement each other, so I kind of dial my game in a little more than just guessing. Just pulling line off a reel for your setback, one, it gets old. Two, it's very it's all over the place. Okay, there's no consistency in that presentation for the most part. So I can utilize high-vis line and mark it. I can utilize standard mono and put on either small bobber stop knots, work very well, as long as they can pass through the guides. Before I mentioned on this tournament series, this 8-foot, the guides are extremely small. You cannot pass knots through the guides on this particular rod, so I would have to run high-vis line on here and utilize my permanent marker, which works great. Did it for years, okay? So keep in mind that I can truly set myself up for being successful on the water chasing kokanee if I'm just getting into it and don't truly understand what types of gear I should be looking for. Get on eBay, get on OfferUp, get on some of the Facebook options you have to look for sales in various locations. Look for fishing gear, look for kokanee gear. Start looking at some of these older model Abu Garcias and other open face reels that will work well. Don't get the real large ones, obviously, on small kokanee rods. You don't need that. They hold plenty of line, trust me. A couple hundred yards of line on these small spools is not a problem. As far as line weight, I typically go with at least 10-pound mono as your main line. Some guys have started fishing braid and they'll put on like a 30-foot top shot of monofilament. That also works well too, and it has a very small diameter for drag in the water. So that is also something to consider, is utilizing a light braid of, say, 20-pound test and then put on a 10-pound test of monofilament. You're going to be doing just fine in that regard. Not to mention your high-vis braid. It's easy to mark with your permanent marker to tell you exactly where that is. And I wouldn't put a whole bunch of marks on there. I literally would go 50 foot, 75, and 100 foot and call it good. So just a few tips to think about as far as getting setbacks and depth. Options to look at for rods and reels that's not, again, going to break your bank, and you should be able to put that together in no time and be out kokanee fishing this season. All right, we come back. We're going to jump out for a quick break. We come back. We are going to be in the kitchen with Chef Kelly and Sherry for another fantastic recipe of the week.